What are the most recent advancements in establishing AI safeguards for clinical practice? In what way does AI intersect with democracy and its preservation? How are the frameworks for regulating AI progressing and aligning across the US, the UK, and the European Union? I'm Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo, and I'm the editor-in-chief of JAMA and the JAMA Network. This conversation is part of a series of videos and podcasts hosted by JAMA in which we explore the rapidly evolving intersection of AI and clinical practice. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Alondra Nelson. She is the Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study and a scholar of the impact of science and technological advances on health and society. She recently finished serving as Deputy Assistant and Acting Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Earlier this year, she was included in Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in AI. Welcome, Dr. Nelson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bibbins-Domingo. Great to see you.
Wonderful. I hope we can do this on a first-name basis. Is that okay with you?
Sounds good.
Okay, wonderful. I've been really looking forward to talking with you because you have been a scholar of advances and their impact on society, oftentimes through an equity lens, long before we were all of us talking about AI all the time. So I'm curious if you could just tell us how you got to be interested in this field, how you ended up going from an academic position to serving in the White House, and we can use that as a backdrop to then have our conversation about AI.
Well, great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak with you. I've been probably for the last 15 years of my career, I have been a scholar of human genetics, both the history of human genetics, looking at our early attempts to battle diseases like sickle cell anemia. So it was from that I came to work on and think with colleagues about sort of what we used to call big data, and of course, big data is one of the sort of enabling sort of resources of AI. Data to me has always meant human beings. And so my perspective has been always a kind of equity lens and an inequality lens. So the bridge for me was that the Obama administration, I think in 2015, President Obama, as part of his State of the Union address, announces the Precision Medicine Initiative. So this was sort of in my research career, sort of following the trajectory of human genome research and these sort of big projects. So that was my initial bridge, and I was interested in the Precision Medicine Project and the promises of what became what is now all of us. And it was through meeting that network of people that I was invited to work in the Biden-Harris White House at the Office of Science and Technology Policy.
That's such a wonderful story. It all makes complete sense to me now. And I love the idea that data is always about people, because I think that's some of the things that we're going to talk about. So we started this series. We're at about the year anniversary of ChatGPT's introduction. What I'd love for you to talk about is just your most recent experience in trying to create policy frameworks around this, and to reflect a little bit with me about the Biden administration's recent executive order on artificial intelligence. Tell us, if you can summarize for our general clinical audience here, what was the goal of this order, and what are the most important features in this order?
I come from a perspective that to create guardrails actually are opportunities for creativity and innovation, not that creating guardrails staunches innovation or stops innovation. The creativity that we come to as researchers often comes because we're having to think anew, because we're trying to mitigate risks or think about new challenges and the like. And so I think when ChatGPT came on the scene about a year ago, it accelerated all of that work that had already been going on and that people had been talking about. And it was also clear that after the last Congress, we got very close to having a national kind of federal data privacy law, but we didn't quite make it. And so I think part of what you see reflected in this executive order, it's 111 pages. I would only encourage the wonkiest of your viewers and the audience to read it. But, I think it's quite fascinating because it is an attempt to work at the executive level, appreciating that we're not going to have legislation for guardrails, but that an executive order has the force of law, even if it's not legislation. And what's fascinating about this executive order is that it takes seriously the broad scope and potential of AI. And so it has things that are about employment. There's lots there about healthcare. There are interventions around security, both sort of economic security and national security, as well as, privacy, algorithmic bias, and discrimination as well. So it's really, I think, an executive order that appreciates that artificial intelligence tools and systems are going to become the infrastructure for our lives, for how we do our research, for how we do our shopping. I mean, it's already very much a part of our lives, and attempts to sort of address that sort of broader suite of things. So how do we need to, protect privacy, or perhaps have regulations around just the minimal use of data that one needs to do something, so that we don't do lots of things that are important, particularly for medicine, scare off patients from wanting to use the tools and systems because they feel threatened, scare off workers. How do you sort of involve people in these processes, and how do we think about processes at FDA and HHS and other places in the context of appreciating the sort of substantive transformation that's going to happen with AI. So this executive order, which is, I think, probably the longest in American history, but we'll leave it to the historians to check on that, is really an attempt to begin to use the sort of term in Washington is the whole of government, to sort of address the potential risks of AI and its potential benefits.
I like the way you said that this leads first with the full potential of AI, and the opportunities, but that the guardrails are not there to impede the opportunities, but actually to unlock, in fact, many of the creative opportunities here. How would this have looked differently if we had a different data privacy landscape, do you think?
So right now we have a kind of patchwork. So the state of Illinois, for example, has legislation around biometric data, some of which would apply to, I think, healthcare. California has, privacy law. So what federal regulation would have done is created, sort of more standard rules of the road for all systems. I worked in the White House on something called the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which were principles for how we want to do this and do this well. And that was things that, like, systems should be effective. They should be tested. We should be, thinking iteratively about coming back to do risk assessment, and to do auditing of systems, and the like. And so the executive order also includes a set of principles for, how government in particular is going to be engaging in using AI tools and systems.
What AI tools are you currently using?
I'm using ChatGPT.
What do you use it for?
I use it to, I'm playing around with it to, I think, understand, as somebody who's interested in being a policy advisor, what it can do and not do. So I'm actually quite concerned about the 2024 elections. They're happening, I think, in every major democracy, from Indonesia to India to the United States. And how accurately do they sort of synthesize election information? I mean, you're from California, I'm from California. We have a whole history of referendum that are so long, that have gotten just longer. And, if you pop those into ChatGPT, how does it synthesize for you? And how accurate is it? If you go through and read the whole thing, does it summarize correctly? So I'm interested in just playing around with its possibilities, and its potentials. And of course, it's the case that I was intrigued by, a couple of weeks ago, OpenAI announced that it's going to have an app store. So we're about to see a whole bunch of sort of applications to layer on top of that. So
wonderful. Is there an AI tool you would never use at this point?
I think, biometric tools, I think tools that I think folks in clinical practice know this very well, that if you have someone's genome, you have someone's genome. You can't erase it. It doesn't go away. And so, tools that take genetic data, fingerprints, irises, and these sorts of things that are kind of permanent identity markers of people. Of course, we have a big problem with facial recognition technology in the United States and in policing. And so I would never use it, but I also hope I think there's some instances in which no one should ever use them.
I really enjoyed reading your article in Science, talking about it's easy to become cynical about the constant refrain about safety, and that are we worried about the robots taking over, or should we be more worried about those everyday ways in which the application of these technologies is already shifting what we're doing, how we're doing it, whether it's in healthcare or other aspects of our life, and how do we pitch the guardrails in a way that allows for us to move forward while still recognizing that really, today everything is happening now, and we need to have things in place now for those everyday ways in which we're either not meeting our goals or, in fact, opening other avenues that might have consequences that we don't really care for.
I think this is the sort of moment that we find ourselves in, and I do think that the executive order attempts to sort of do both and. For example, so I think it makes certain assertions about, that there should be protections against algorithmic bias and discrimination, things that are causing harm to people right now, even as we are looking at sort of future risks that we might have with regards to, bioweapons, synthetic biology, the kinds of potential risks that the sort of the sort of marriage of engineering and, sort of biological research potentially make possible. With that, I wrote that editorial in Science with my colleague Seth Lazar, who's a philosopher actually at the Australian National University. And partly what we were trying to assert was that the AI safety conversation had shifted over the last year. So there had been a conversation in years past about trust and safety. So, there was an expectation that many of the particularly big tech organizations would have trust and safety teams that would be trying to ensure that their products were, not damaging the public, and to, content moderation, a whole sort of suite of issues around safety. As we came to have a national conversation that was, at its worst, a bit more fear-mongering about what AI might mean, the idea of safety, a couple of things happened. One was some of these very large companies shut down, reduced their trust and safety teams. So what they had imagined safety to be before somehow was not safety as it was previously imagined. And, as we head into an election year, content moderation challenges around the ability for AI to sort of increase the scale and velocity of some of the things we're already concerned about in social media still remains a challenge. So we still need trust and safety teams. At the same time, there was a kind of new elite crop of sort of safety research labs emerging, and the sort of, quote unquote, frontier AI labs like OpenAI, like Anthropic, that wanted to create for their work a pretty narrow lane, I think, initially, of what safety meant. And safety was, frankly, the robot's not killing us, right? Like that not leading to, total extinction. And, I think we can imagine, government, large organizations, small organizations being able to think about that whole spectrum of safety and not having to, make choices about whether things should be within the sort of bucket of safety or not in that way.
Yeah, I really like that point you make in the editorial that we don't want to leave it to just those that understand the technology or who are actively innovating in the technology to set then the priorities or to define the agenda for safety, given its impact on so many parts of our life that there need to be many other voices at the table. I really do think that applies particularly for the application of AI in clinical practice, where many people have pointed out that this isn't the time for clinicians and others who think about what's important in healthcare to stand on the sidelines and say, well, we don't really understand everything behind the technology, that we all have to have a role to play in sort of setting these priorities. And I'd love for you to reflect a little bit on how other countries, the UK, how the EU has thought about creating a regulatory framework or regulatory environment for AI. I've heard many people describe this as being different in the EU, for example. What would you say the biggest differences are or similarities?
Well, I think, that question changed after October 30th when President Biden signed this executive order. I mean, a lot of the conversation about the differences was, what's the U.S. going to do, if anything at all? And we were waiting on Congress versus this kind of robust multi-year system that had been built out by the EU. There's the sort of EU had paused a bit and sort of after it, over the course of the last year, gone from having a kind of risk-based model. So, there's AI that's high risk, medium risk, low risk, and that there would be more regulations for things that are at different risk categories, to adding to that a consideration of large language models and other kinds of, different kinds of AI, generative AI that hadn't been imagined as the sort of regulatory object, the thing that they were concerned about in the first instance when the process that led to the initial drafting of the EU AI Act was getting underway. The US doesn't have formal regulation, so the EU work is already more stringent. It's certainly it's multilateral. So, it's 27 member states. And I think so that, creating some sort of synergy or harmonization around, amongst all of those different countries, I think is significant and notable. But, now there is some, I think, in response in part to President Biden's executive order, this concern, I think, in Europe around innovation. And when to the point where we were just talking about, at what point is there a tipping point at which innovation, regulation sort of prevents innovation? And so I think they're wrestling right now with that problem as they work to finish it. So I would say it will have the sort of force of sort of regulatory law when it's completed. That's much stronger than anything that we have in the U.S. That as things stand, it's very much making the case that there are these kind of different risk categories. The challenge, and that I think something like generative AI presents, is that if it's a general purpose tool, you don't know at the front end what the risk category is because it's not been used yet, and it might be used for a whole range of things. And so that brings, I think, a challenge. And I think it also, for people who want to work in the sort of, healthcare policy or tech policy space or the intersection of the two, I think it presents a kind of strategic conundrum for us. The FDA says this is a medical device, and if it designates something as a medical device, then all of these other kinds of laws, norms, and procedures fall into place. Large language models, is that a medical device? Is it not a medical device? Like, how do you think about that? And so I guess maybe and do we need to shift in the world of generative AI to thinking less about the specific device, as we might call it, to the outcomes that we want, right? So whether or not you're using an artificial tool or system, across a wide spectrum, it could be predictive, it could be, generative AI. The outcome that we want is for it to be safe, to be proven effective, to have some transparency, to have some, particularly in clinical practice. So, I think the EU is one model. What we saw in early November in the UK was, I think, another model. The UK is suggesting that they're going to do what they're calling light touch regulation. So not much regulation at all, and really sort of dig into what they're calling safety, these kind of AI safety institutes, which are kind of private public sort of R&D. Safety needs to be this broader spectrum if we're going to commit resources, and there are things that we need to make people's lives better right now using these tools.
So you've been a scholar of this for a while. Is AI something that requires us to think in different ways about setting up the guardrails, or is this some variation on the same story as what we would have learned from if we thought about where we would have had been with genetic testing? How do you think about this? Is this all the same, or it's something different?
There is so much hype around AI, and you and I were around when the sort of, Human Genome Project genotyping a hype cycle happened as well. So lots of interesting, good research, shifts in diagnostics. I mean, to the extent that we might have something like a cure for sickle cell anemia, which is something that I've worked on and, as a sociologist, it is the sort of proof of some of that hype, right? But there was a lot of hype besides that's not been proved out. So I've been encouraged that there are people who are not AI scientists who are willing to say, this isn't magic. And there are things about this that are similar to things that we've had to deal with in the past, which are the conditions of our work, whether or not you're a nurse or nurse practitioner, radiologist, or an actor. But there are things that are new, and I would put it in a category. So working in the tech policy space in the White House, we would use critical and emerging technologies or new and emerging technologies. So I think what AI shares with that kind of other subset of things and where it is new is that the tools, because we have so much of this is being driven by commercial interests, and so much of this is being released before we can fully understand it. So, do understand that last November, part of the sort of awesomeness of these tools is that they're cool, they're fun, they're interesting. But it was also the case that sort of no one knew they were coming. No one knew they were going to be released, and they were sort of, doing all of this transformation. And so we now can anticipate, in part because of the disruptive business cycle in places like Silicon Valley, that there's going to be this kind of, constant churn of new technologies. And I think what we need to do to think about this suite of critical and new technologies or new and emerging technologies together is to sort of revisit the kind of core values and the core outcomes that we want with the technologies, and not try to sort of make the social compact, make regulation, make our organizations all over and guardrails all over every time for every new tool, every new technology.
Do you have one or two top priorities that you have that you hope either in the technology or in the regulation of the technology that you hope are addressed in the next year?
I think truly that this moment is a real moment for sort of democratic engagement. And, so I hope it's an opportunity for my priority is sort of engaging a broader public around these issues and helping them to feel, I think, empowered around having something to say about how these tools and systems are used in their lives.
Yeah, I really like that, because there's a tendency to get caught up in that this is all new and we're completely unmoored from anything that we've encountered before. And yet in the end, it still comes down to, as you said, our values. And then I think in the clinical practice space or even in the journal space, like we're looking for improvements in clinical outcomes. We're looking for improvements in health. We're looking for making sure that inequities that we know already exist are not worsened by them and hopefully are improved. And so it sounds like in the end, we have to come back to those sort of basic values.
Yeah, that's the North Star of the clinical practice, in some ways, regardless of what the technology is, right? It's either advancing that or it's not,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you on this issue. I hope we have a chance to talk again. I have a feeling there'll be plenty to talk about as we go forward, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing what comes of your new book. So very exciting.
Thank you so much for having me. I very much appreciate it.
And to our audience, thank you for watching and listening. as well as giving us feedback on this series. We also welcome submissions in response to JAMA's AI and Medicine call for papers. Until next time, stay informed and stay inspired. We hope you'll join us for future episodes of the AI and Clinical Practice series, where we will continue to discuss the opportunities and challenges posed by AI. For more videos and podcasts, subscribe to the JAMA Network YouTube channel and follow JAMA Network podcasts, available wherever you get your podcasts.